Reading about Dorothy Mull, you feel as if you wouldn't be surprised if she was on the covers of Sydney Anglican's, National Geographic and Vogue all at the same time. Now, why was that? Let's now get to know a little bit about this amazing woman, Dorothy Mull. Sadly, I didn't have access to her diaries. We don't know where they are, if in fact they still exist. After Howard Mull's death, Dorothy's diaries were given to her brother John. If her diaries are found, I think it would be excellent and profitable for the church in Australia and also CMS if someone wrote another paper on her. Most of the records we have about Dorothy are things that people wrote about her, but we do have access to some of the things that Dorothy wrote. What I want to do in this talk, since time is brief, is to focus on some of the things that Dorothy wrote to try and get inside her head and see what made her tick. And we're going to focus on her life and ministry in China. In the chapter of the book that's going to follow this conference, I will include more of her time in Sydney and so more of her marriage to Howard. But I thought since more of us will be less familiar with Dorothy's background in China before she married Howard, that would be a good place to start to help get to know her. Dorothy Ann Mowll was born to Reformed evangelical parents. Both of her parents had a deep commitment to worldwide mission with a focus on the Indigenous church. Her family also prioritised serving others above worldly comforts. Dorothy's father, the Reverend John Martin, left England in 1881 as a single man to serve with the Church Missionary Society, CMS, in the Fujian province in China. Amongst other things, he was involved in evangelism and theological education, and he ended up being the principal of the CMS Theological College in Fuzhou, which focused on training and equipping Chinese men for ministry. Dorothy's mother, Eliza Ann Goldie, she was born, also went to China that same year in 1881 as a single missionary. Eliza and John married 2 years later after being in China, and they were involved in evangelism together. Eliza also began a Bible school for Chinese women, and what she did, she would get women from the district to come and study at the Bible school for a year. Then the hope would be that these Chinese women would go back and teach their neighbours. She also started a boarding school for Chinese girls. It was said that Chinese women led cloistered lives, unable by custom to leave their homes. One of the missionaries who worked with Eliza wrote, "If we can get the children, we have every hope of getting the mothers. If we can reach the mothers and children, we shall reach the fathers." There are exceptions, but women can rule here in their own way. 6 years after her parents arrived in China, so did her aunt Emma Goldie, and she served in the same area as John and Eliza. Now, during one of her parents' furloughs back in England, Dorothy was born at her grandmother's home in Bath on the 18th of June 1890. 1 month later, she was baptised by her father. John and Eliza returned to China with their children when Dorothy was 6 months old. Tragically, her mother Eliza would die when Dorothy was only 4 years old. Dorothy would continue to be exposed to grief and suffering of various forms throughout her life, but there's no evidence in what she wrote and what other people wrote about her that this stopped her doing things or made her inward looking, rather quite the opposite. Following the death of his wife, John Martin took his 5 surviving children, one died 7 months after his wife, back to England in 1895 for them to be cared for by family members before he returned to China to continue missionary work. Dorothy's aunt Emma, who had been in China as a missionary, later returned to England, and by at least 1901, Dorothy and her siblings are living with Emma in Bath. It's not known how long Dorothy lived with Emma, nor the influence and impact Emma had on the young Dorothy, how much they spoke about China, about mission work, but Emma subsequently went back to China to continue missionary work. By 1911, Dorothy had moved with two of her brothers to live in London with two other aunts. And during this time, Dorothy was involved in tertiary study. I wanted to touch briefly on Dorothy's parents and aunt to show that Dorothy had examples around her right from when she was born of people taking risks for the kingdom of God, people starting up ministries, and people very interested in wanting to build up the local church in China. And I assume that would have been influential in her formation as a person, as a Christian, as a woman, as a wife. We do have a couple of quotes from her diaries, and it's not surprising that Dorothy wrote, "The frontiers of the kingdom of God were never advanced by men and women of caution." Dorothy wrote that in 1957, the year she died, but it well sums up the woman she had been for decades. She was not a woman of caution. She did not give in to fear. She took risks for the kingdom of God. Now, Dorothy's education and missionary preparation. Dorothy attended Bath High School for Girls, where she excelled in the classroom and in hockey. It kind of seems a bit random, but that's what they say. So she was good at everything, basically. That's what it says. Dorothy decided she wanted to return to China as a missionary herself, and so after finishing school, she began to equip herself for the task. She took cookery classes, studied teaching, nursing, and finally missionary studies with CMS. Dorothy arrived in China in 1915. She was the daughter of missionary parents who had served in China, and all her siblings had been born in China. She was familiar with the culture. She had a good grasp on the language, and this, combined with her dark brown eyes and hair, apparently all helped the Chinese feel confident in her. Dorothy didn't return to where her parents had served. Rather, she went to serve in Western China, a more remote mountainous area. We hear about her work during this time through her annual letters back to CMS that each missionary was required to write. So the CMS archives have 4 annual letters from Dorothy. So her first letter in 1917. In her brief 1917 letter, Dorothy begins by saying that she has focused on language study, taught at the girls' school, helped with the women's work, and visited some of the outstations. We hear firsthand her love of the mountains and their beauty, and this is a recurring theme, but also the desperate spiritual and physical needs of the people. She doesn't mention this in her letter, but in 1917, she and a friend set out to climb the 19,000 feet, 9 pinnacle mountain. Her friend stopped, didn't make it to the peak, but Dorothy reached the peak with a local person, and this was the highest point than any previous foreign climber had been. Her second letter in 1918 is a lot longer, and it's much more sober in tone. She says after 2 years of language learning, her move to the outpost of Longan was unexpected, but she volunteered for it because she felt a definite call. And it's fascinating to learn that as a child, she had longed to do pioneer missionary work. 19 was also a time with a lot of looting in the area that she was in, and they were locked in the city for 2 months as a result. So this caused a lot of stress for the locals and for them. She started a school, and she really desired to train the Chinese to be teachers at that school. Dorothy speaks of numerous other things, including going to the furthest northernmost outstation with a local Chinese Bible woman. She writes, "The children were a great help in attracting the grown-ups as we taught. We had a room full of women and children. Men crowded at the door, attracted by the singing. And we tried to make the most of these opportunities, talking with the help of pictures on the prodigal son, Pilgrim's Progress, etc. We were seldom alone till 8 or 9 p.m, as women would stay behind to talk. There were no Christian women in the place. She also wrote of the Tibetan mountain that she most wants to climb as well. Now, Dorothy closes her letter on a much more personal note. I felt highly privileged to be called to such a work, to preach the gospel to so many who have never heard before, the sort of pioneer work I had dreamt of as a girl at home. I hope I shall always remain as enthusiastic, but I know I wish that I were more qualified for the work. I long for a bigger grasp on the language, to understand more of the lives and thoughts of the people, and to grow in my own spiritual life. I want a greater love for these women and a greater yearning to win them for Christ. Well, letter 3 is in 1919. Out of the 4, this is the hardest one for Dorothy to write. Dorothy mentioned several times that she is alone in a lot of the work. It seems that they were very short of missionaries at this time, and it seems Dorothy felt hurt that she seemed to be blamed for something outside of her control. By all accounts, she worked very hard, but her having to stay at the school, since a foreigner needed to be there, meant that the outstations were neglected, and so she was told she was not doing the work of one missionary, and so therefore she was moved. Between letter 3 and letter 4, Dorothy returns to England for furlough. 2 interesting things happened on this furlough. She went to the consecration of Howard Mowll on the 22nd of June, 1922. Howard, as we just heard, was being consecrated as Assistant Bishop of West China. And she also went to his farewell a couple of months, 6 months later, on the 9th of January in 1923. Dorothy didn't imagine at all that in October the following year she would become his wife. Well, Dorothy's final annual letter in 1923. Once again, Dorothy is moved, this time to Hanchow, and it's for women's work. She's also appointed the supervisor of the primary schools, and she also teaches, this is a bit different, temporarily in a boys' school, whereas previously it had always been in the girls' schools. Tragically, though, she also talks about the fact that 2 male missionaries are shot dead by a local gang. Now, when the deaths occurred, Dorothy was staying with the wife of one of these men, Mrs. Whiteside. Again, Dorothy's concern for evangelism amongst the women comes out. She wrote, "We have started a women's evangelistic meeting every week, looking to the Chinese Christian women to bring their neighbours and friends, and the attendance has been excellent. This effort is giving the Christian women a definite share in the work, a share which they can all take, and it is bringing us in touch with a larger circle of women. Mrs. Whiteside has a unique opportunity of appealing to these women. She tells them how she has suffered with them, yet in these days of sorrow, anxiety and fear, they may have peace, the peace which she possesses in her great sorrow." Dorothy also writes of one of their first ordained Chinese deacons and the work he's doing and how well he and Dorothy work together, and how the station is really fortunate to have several Chinese Christian male leaders. But she finishes her letter with an interesting note. Interesting since we know what happens to her. She says her travelling is limited because of the presence of gangs, and that the gangs also mean she doesn't know what her future ministry will look like. Well, Dorothy's life is very soon about to change, as 11 months later she would marry Howard Mowll. So her missionary and ministry service as a married woman. On August the 27th, 1924, Howard announced his engagement to Dorothy. Just 2 months later, on the 23rd of October, they were married by Bishop Cassels, who was one of the Cambridge 7, and he was Howard's bishop in West China. Marcus Lone writes, "They had met in London and Shanghai, and he had seen her from time to time. He had soon found out how much she was in demand and had made up his mind to win her hand." So Howard was very keen. An insight into Dorothy's mind during her engagement is seen in a letter she wrote to a friend, Miss Pym, 2 weeks before she married. I feel in a dream and can hardly believe it is really me, although I am very happy. He is a dear and we are awfully fond of each other. It was just suggested in May, but I was so anxious to be quite sure it was God's will from every point of view that we waited 3 months to pray about it. Sintu folk, foreign and Chinese, are very sad at my going. I am very sorry to leave the work here. Please continue to pray for me as I start along this new path. It will be different from the past. Life in Chenghu, a big house, entertaining, etc. Also long journeys through the diocese, which I shall enjoy. I could never have faced the new duties, etc., unless I felt confident that it is God's will and He will supply my need. As a married woman, Dorothy was noted for her hospitality. The Chinese found a warm welcome at the Moll's home, and it was also a place of respite for many missionaries. In China and in Sydney, people loved being in her company. She made people feel relaxed and conversation came easy to her. People were drawn to her. She had great warmth. People had deep affection for her. Dorothy was also known to keep a cool head in stressful situations, and this was no doubt wonderful for Howard, both in China and in Sydney. The Moulls were victims on a number of occasions of robberies and assaults in China, and also of at least one kidnapping. One time she helped bandage Howard after he had been stabbed. These same robbers clubbed her in the head. She tried to calm the robbers by asking them to have a cup of tea. Dorothy had a conviction the whole time she was in China that missionaries would train local Chinese women, but it would be the Chinese Christian women who would then be in positions of leadership. This ministry philosophy is seen clearly in an account of a talk she gave in Armidale in 1934. And it says, so this was reported in the local Armidale paper. The Chinese Christians were always looking to missionaries for leadership. Mrs. Mowll said she was always asking these young women what would happen if the missionaries left the country, and she endeavoured to stir them up to realise their responsibilities. In 1927, communism spread and the missionaries were compelled to leave. They were away for 12 months, and the Christian Chinese women had to decide whether they had become Christians from conviction or merely because they were keen on the foreigners. It was a time of testing. When they returned 12 months later, the missionaries found that the timid Bible women had risen to the occasion and had gone to the temples and preached to the crowds. As a result of being left alone, they had shown their colours and carried on. There was no longer any need for leadership, and the missionaries were enabled to devote their time to training others. The women were working in a wonderful way, and all were linked together to show their love for the Lord. Dorothy died aged 67 years on the 23rd of December 1957 in Sydney from Hodgkin's disease. Howard died within a year of his wife on the 24th of October 1958. They had no children that took the Mowll name, but they had many spiritual children. Dorothy Mull was a unique woman. She mapped parts of China that were previously uncharted, which led to her being made a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. As wife of the Archbishop, she was president of the Mothers' Union. During World War II, she coordinated clergy wives as the workforce for the Church of England National Emergency Fund. She helped organise the purchase of Gilbulla Conference Centre. She was appointed an Order of the British Empire for her community work. She was the one who had the vision to begin Mowll Village for retired clergy and missionaries. Dorothy Mull was an amazing woman, a very unique woman. She did impressive things in terms of this world's eyes, but she did many things in God's eyes that will last for eternity. Doing God's will was really her concern. From Dorothy's 1957 diary. I profess no other share in the selection of my lot than this, a ready answer to the will of God. Thanks, Mark.
Right, so the first question is about the photograph. The second question is about any links between Mrs. Mull and Mary Andrews.
Thanks, Jeff. So we've got copies of the photographs, not the originals, in the archives, don't we, Erin? They're copies of the photographs? I think, yeah, in the, so we've got Mothers Union archives in the Moore College Library, and I did go through them a while ago, but I don't think they were the original photographs. They're copies of them. So that's where a number of these photographs are from. In terms of her relationship with Mary Andrews, I don't know a lot about that. I do know that they occasionally had meals in Chinatown along with other former Chinese missionaries and enjoyed that. So, yeah. But that's something I can look at between now and the book writing. Yeah, Mary, that's what I just said. Yeah.
Good. Okay, any other questions? Yes. Okay, well, it's a good question. I'll repeat it out. It's a question in the biography about the church and Mull's ministry there and post-communism. Any survival or evidence of the influence of that church?
Well, yeah, I guess, Eddie, thanks for that, Eddie. I don't know all the details of that, but I do know that their mission philosophy, which is, heavily influenced by Henry Venn and, the three selves in terms of the Indigenous church and the priority of that, that did well in terms of wanting to raise up, local leaders, to raise up Chinese leaders, men and women. And so no doubt that, it's no surprise now that there's millions and millions of Chinese Christians in China. In terms of the Anglican Church in China, I don't know if Peter Jensen or someone else knows more details about that. No. Okay.
It's helpful. It's very good.
Thanks.
There's a book by Alec Ryrie, a recent book called Protestantism. It has a fantastic chapter on Protestantism in China and maps some of these things. It'll be interesting to coordinate what Alec might say with some of Mull's life and ministry. Yeah. Question is, why was she given an OBE?
Yeah, so one of the references I read said it was for community work. Another one made it more specific in terms of her work because of her work during World War II. But I don't know if it was more general community work. The
question is about Dorothy Mull and whether she travelled around with the Archbishop during his Archiepiscopal ministry in Sydney.
She definitely did travel at certain times with the Archbishop, and she also travelled independently and a number of occasions as well. She also got sick later in her life as well, so that may have curtailed her travelling. Yeah.
I think I read there was a car accident that she and he were in the Diocese of Grafton one day going out to a service, and the car flipped, and so obviously it was travelling with them. They survived, and the bishop says something like, they survived, and then they came to church, and he preached a very interesting and engaging sermon. Okay, the question is, where could one purchase the biography? I assume you're talking about the biography of Howard Mull, written by Sir Marcus Lone. Is that the one down there? You can borrow my copy if you like. Where would one purchase it? One could purchase it probably if you go to eBay or if you go to Amazon, you might find a second-hand copy. I don't know if they're still printing them. I would go on the internet and I'd look at an eBay or Amazon or something like that. Or, of course, we have the fantastic Moore College Library. And if you're a member of the college, you have a library card, you can borrow from here. I'm interested in, the language of frontiers and pioneering and advancing and the story of the mountain climbing to the top of the mountain, going to the northern outstations, I was really struck by that. And I was wondering, a lot of that discussion was a China discussion. Here in Sydney and Australia, what that sort of pioneering spirit, do we see that influence or impact perhaps some other women or those who she did ministry with? Do we see that sort of carry on, spiritual children perhaps?
We don't have a lot of evidence of that because that's the great thing in terms of looking at her missionary letters, that she's actually writing them. And so in terms of, there's occasional letters and occasional things to her while she's in Sydney. But we have evidence, though, of her in Sydney just continuing to be the woman that she was in China. So, and that's seen clearly in her coordinating women with the Senate things, but also just doing ministry and getting on with that and loving and serving people. But yeah, I think it was fascinating that even as a young child, she had made up in her mind or that she really wanted to do pioneer work. And so, you know, whereas some people may be thinking, oh, this is going to be scary, this is going to be that, but she just had that. And so that became very normal in her thinking from a very young age. And then that kept making her be the woman that she wanted to be. And that really helped Howard as well.
Fantastic.
In his partner in life and ministry.